Good morning, everyone. So I realized about 5 minutes ago that I never created an agenda for today. So I just posted that in the chat. If you are looking for it online, that is my fault. But going to be standard agenda. We don't have any extra special guests, but our standard special guests. So going to give just another minute here before we jump in. Let's see. We might have some new folks on the phone today, particularly a few emergency managers from the Southwest. So I just want to take a minute and do some basic introductions. My name is Megan Holcomb. I'm the climate specialist with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, co-chair of this water availability task force, along with Tracy. Tracy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. Tracy Kozloff, Deputy State Engineer with the Division of Water Resources, co-chairing with Megan.
And if we could take a few moments, if you have never joined this call or if you're new just for the season, would you take a minute to introduce yourself? You may also do that in the chat if that is easier.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Bully. I'm a South Supervisor for DHSEM for the Field Services section. I've got myself on here, and it looks like I got a couple of my RFMs that have joined you well as well.
Thanks for joining.
Hi all, Jason Feinhout from Denver Water.
Who do we? Go ahead.
Hi, this is David Graff with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I'm our Northwest region water specialist out of Grand Junction office.
Thanks.
Good morning. My name is David Osborne. I am the field manager in the San Luis Valley region, and appreciate being on this morning.
Thanks for joining, David. Anyone else from the Southwest in emergency management or DHSEM? Don't see. Who do we have from the Colorado Climate Center? Tracy, are you seeing who's on? Let's see.
Russ is here.
Oh, hey, Russ. Thanks. We can, if there are no more introductions, feel free to take it away, Russ. I think you should be able to have controls or.
Okay. No, it says host disabled participant screen.
All right. Try it now.
Aha.
Perfect.
Okay. Looks all right. And you can hear me okay?
Yep, looks good.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for being here this morning, everybody. I'm back in my actual work office for the first time in quite a while. So we'll hopefully the internet still works here and everything, but I think we should be good. All right. Well, I will jump right in, I guess. Feel free to stop me if you have questions as we go, or of course there should be time at the end. So we'll start with our kind of usual rundown of where we are in the water year. And of course, last week we had the classic May in Colorado with big snow in the mountains and tornadoes on the plains. And so all the good things that we kind of expect in this time of year as we transition from the winter into the summer. So we'll first kind of do the rundown looking back to April of where our last full month and where that stood nationally and in Colorado. So this is the April temperatures. For Colorado, you can see we ended up kind kind of right in the middle of the pack in terms of temperature historically. And the Southwest was warm, but much of the South was cool. And we'll see kind of the variations across the state that we had there. If we go back for the water year as a whole, back to last October, we're at the 28th warmest October through April. So not excessively warm, but still quite warm by long-term standards, a degree and a half above the 20th century average. And if we look at precipitation, April was generally a dry month across the state as a whole, but there were some very significant exceptions to that in certain areas that we'll take a look at. But it statewide ended up 18th driest in terms of Aprils. And you can see going back to the start of the water year, we've had statewide dry months, all of them except for March, which was wet. And we'll see where May is shaping up pretty wet. So we'll kind of see where that ends up when we get there. But back to the start of the water year statewide, about a little over 1.5 inches below the 20th century average. So, and again, these statewide numbers are pretty misleading in a lot of ways. And that'll kind of be the story as we go through everything that we're looking at here today. But that's where we stood at the end of April. If we zoom in on just Colorado, looking back to April, Eastern Plains were cooler than average. West of the Divide was near average to above average mostly in southwestern Colorado in terms of temperature. If we look at the water year as a whole, that's kind of been the story of the whole water year back to October, where east of the Divide has been near normal to a bit cooler than normal. West of the Divide has been warmer than normal for the water year as a whole. And then looking at precipitation in April, what we can see is that the Front Range and the northeast corner of the state had quite a wet month in April. So here the greens are kind of the dividing line of this is percent of normal. So the greens are the greens to the blues are above average. The yellows to the browns are below average. And so Front Range, northeastern Colorado were quite wet during April. All of the rest of the state was very dry, especially the West Slope. And parts of southeast Colorado were very dry for the month of April. And if we combine March and April, then we really see that in northeastern Colorado, a lot of places that are 200 to 300% of normal, so 2 to 3 times the normal precipitation in a lot of northeastern Colorado over those 2 months. But then western Colorado was very dry during that period. We have some spots that are 10 to 30% of normal in there. So a lot of variations as we go across the state. And then for the water year as a whole, that's kind of what it ends up looking like, where the Front Range and much of the mountain areas, kind of the eastern parts of the mountain areas are near to above average for the water year. The northeast corner, a fair amount above average, and then western Colorado and the southern tier below normal precipitation for the water year through the end of April. And kind of one other way of looking at that in terms of the percentiles, again, for the water year as a whole, parts of northeastern Colorado at this little spot in south of Haxton it had very, very heavy rain in a storm in late April, and since then has had quite a bit even more rain. So it's shaping up to be, at least locally, one of the wettest water years on record in that spot. But then west of the Divide, everything much below to much below normal in terms of precipitation. So kind of summarizing that up in these quadrant charts that we've started looking at more frequently. This is statewide, and this is for the water year through April. So October through April, all the historical years, and then this year kind of highlighted with the star there. So these charts basically, so it's precipitation on the x-axis and temperature on the y-axis. And so it just divides it up into these quadrants where the upper left is warm and dry. That's not where you want to be in terms of drought. Warm and wet in the upper right. cool and wet in the lower right, cool and dry in the lower left. And so statewide, and the one other thing to point out here, the dashed lines are the normals, and this is the new normals, so to speak. This is for the 1991 to 2020 period that was just updated recently. And so it includes that more recent decade. So in any case, with respect to that, the water year through April statewide is a fair bit drier than average and just a tiny bit cooler than average that you can see there. But if we did this with respect to the 20th century or the longer term temperature, it would be warmer than average. It's just cooler than average with respect to that more recent period that has been much warmer in general. But again, these statewide numbers don't really tell the whole story. And if we kind of separate this out and first look at, so this is climate division 2, which is basically all of Western Colorado, everything west of the divide. And you can see that it's among the few driest October through April time periods there, just a handful of drier years that are ones that are not ones that you want to be in the company of. 1977, around the turn of the 20th century, 2002, not quite as warm as some of the recent years like 2018 or 1934, but still very much on the warm and dry side in Western Colorado over this period. If we go to the Platte drainage, so this is, the Front Range and most of northeastern Colorado, it ends up in the cool and wet quadrant, a little bit wetter than average and a bit cooler than average there. So again, very stark differences across the Continental Divide, which is really the theme of everything that we've seen in the last couple of months, and that we'll be talking about more as we go along here today. All right, so May so far, it has been a bit more of the same. This is temperature for May through Sunday. And west of the divide has generally been warmer than average, with some spots quite a bit warmer than average in parts of northwestern Colorado down towards the Four Corners being 2 to 3 degrees above normal. East of the divide has generally been near normal to cooler than normal in some spots, a few spots that are 3, 4, 5 degrees below average for the month to date. But the bigger story in May so far has been the precipitation, and just kind of set that up. This is not the current conditions. This is kind of the average, what we expect in May in terms of the proportion of the annual average rain that falls in May historically. So basically, just the way to interpret this is if you have browns on the map, May is usually a dry month. If it's in the whites, it's kind of roughly 1 out of 12, 1/12 of the precipitation falls in May. If it's green, then May is a wet month historically. And so we can see in northeastern Colorado, May is the wettest month in some spots, like Fort Collins. May is our wettest month, and it's generally a wet month in northeast Colorado, and to a lesser extent in southeast Colorado. It's usually dry in the Four Corners, and then kind of in between in much of the rest of western Colorado. So that's sort of what we expect in May, and it's a bit of what we've seen. But really, east of the divide, it's just been almost everywhere has been a very, very wet May. So this is now just the precipitation amounts that are shown here. So this kind of darker green color that covers all of the eastern plains is at least 2 inches, 2 to 4 inches of rain so far in May. And so basically everywhere east of the divide has gotten at least 2 inches of rain so far in May. This bluish color is at least 4 inches. And then we have some pockets with at least 6 inches of rain, with some, like, for example, down here in Kiowa County, very heavy thunderstorms over the weekend, last week and into the weekend. So some really big amounts there. Some big amounts southwest of Pueblo near Rye and Levita and even down into Walsenburg. So some heavy rain, and down in towards Trinidad had heavy rain over the weekend. You go west of the divide, not as dry as April was for sure. You know, a lot of spots that have at least an inch of rain in May so far. So that, you know, some bright spots there, but really the particular bright spots are the San Juans that got a lot of snow last week. So, you know, the deficits there are so big that, you know, one storm is not going to make them up, but at least it was nice to see some, you know, a kind of steady snowstorm at the high elevations and rain at the lower elevations last week, but some pockets that still haven't gotten much of anything in May so far either. And just to kind of look at a few numbers and see what that looks like. This is from our CoagMet network. This is over the last 30 days. So going back to late April, you can see, you know, some pockets in Northeast Colorado, Kiowa County with over 5 inches in the last month. And again, pretty much everywhere this Stratton rain gauge is broken, so don't pay attention to that one. But every place else, you know, 2 to 3 to 4 inches over the last month. West of the divide, still decent amounts for May. You know, a half an inch to an inch and a half most places so far. And if we put that in terms of percent of normal precipitation, you know, spots in southern Colorado, 2 to 3 times the normal May precipitation so far. West of the divide, you know, a lot of spots that have still been dry. Some spots like in the San Juans, down like towards Durango, Pagosa had some good rain last week, are above average for the month. So that's kind of where we are at this point in May. And again, you know, huge variations across the state, with some spots just being incredibly wet and some spots missing out on a lot of that precipitation. So we'll look now at standardized precipitation index. So just as a reminder here, the color scheme here is kind of matched to the US Drought Monitor categories. And this is calculated with respect to the historical climate at each station. And so if you see the yellows down to the reds and browns, it's dry. It's been dry for this time period for that location. If you see the greens to the purples, it's been wet for that location. And this is for 30 days. So this is for the last 30 days, or the last 30 days as of a couple of days ago. So this may have missed even some of the weekend storms on the plains. But what we see here, Front Range and Eastern Plains, all pretty much above average, wetter than normal for the end of April through this point in May. East of the divide, a lot of places near normal, but some pockets that are drier than normal over that 30-day period. We go back to 90 days now. So this goes back to, you know, mid-February. And again, Front Range, northeastern Colorado has been quite wet over that time frame, going back to the huge snowstorm in March, and which was a huge rainstorm on the eastern plains, and then kind of just a series of storms through April and May so far in northeast Colorado. Also at 90-day SPI looking good in the Arkansas Valley and southeastern Colorado. West of the divide, drier than normal, but not outrageously so over these 3 months, although a few pockets like up by Steamboat that look not good. But the further back we go, we're going to just see these get worse. And so we go back to water year to date. So this is back to the start of October. Again, Eastern Plains looking pretty good, near normal to above normal pretty much everywhere. Northwestern Colorado especially, not good over this time frame. If we get into these kind of dark brown dots here, it's among the driest few years on record at those locations. So Steamboat and other spots, Grand Junction, pretty bad. The San Juan's not quite as bad, but still drier than average. And then we go back 12 months. So this goes back to May of last year. And then the situation really, stands out at how bad it's been in northwestern Colorado, really Western Colorado as a whole, because this goes back to the dry spring through summer through fall last year. East of the divide, most places look okay, near normal. The gray dots are near normal, with a few pockets of drier than average, although like Eads, we'll look at Eads in a second, had one of had their driest water year on record last year by a long way, but has gotten a lot of rain this spring. And so things are improving there on the short term, but still some of the longer term dryness showing up there. All right, we'll take a quick spin through these stations that we typically look at. And I'll go kind of quickly through this, but we'll stop at a couple of them to point out some interesting things. I'm not going to show Grand Lake because we missed a lot of data in the fall when the station was in the East Troublesome Fire, essentially. And so we'll show Steamboat instead as a kind of Northern Mountains station to take a look at. And so what we're showing on these, the gray dash line is the long-term average, and then the black lines are this year. And then all these little gray lines are the situation from, this point forward, but historically. So, from May 22nd out through the end of September in all the historical years to kind of see what could happen from this point forward based on history. And so at this point, at Steamboat, way below average. So only 61% of the average, down about 6.5 inches of precipitation since October. And so you can see kind of where we go from here. The seasonal cycle at Steamboat is not quite as pronounced as some other West Slope locations. The monsoon isn't as big of a factor up in northwestern Colorado, and so you kind of can get precipitation all through June and July and August, but there's not kind of a big spike in there. In any case, what you see here is almost certainly will end the water year below normal, aside from the potential of getting a very wet fall. So things not looking great there at this point. And of course, last water year was exceptionally dry in Steamboat and surrounding areas as well. So a big deficit over the last couple of years, and hence the very bad drought conditions that we'll look at in more detail in a minute. Grand Junction, similar story, only half the normal precipitation through this point in the water year. If we go back to a couple of water years, so back to October of 2019, only 58% of the normal over that year and a half period. So just continues to be very, very dry on the western slope. And May through June are not typically wet times in Grand Junction, so we kind of will have to hold out until hopefully the monsoon actually happens this year. But kind of historically, we would expect the next month and a half or so to be quite dry in Grand Junction, and then we can hope for a wet monsoon season. But it's going to likely stay dry for a while, and then we'll see what happens after that. But not good position to be in at this point. Similar story at Montrose, 65% of the long-term average through this point in the water year. Mesa Verde in the Four Corners area, similar story, only 56% of the average for this water year so far. If we go back to October 2019, 58% of normal, down almost a foot of precipitation over that year and a half or so time period. If we go into the San Luis Valley, Alamosa has actually had they had a good rainstorm last week. And if we go back to kind of the start of the water year, the big snowstorm in October, so they're a bit above average at this point in the water year with their wetter time of year coming up. So things are not looking so bad in the San Luis Valley at this point. Pueblo, a huge May so far. You can see there. I'm not sure what I didn't look at the exact tally in May so far, but you can see 135% of the average at this point, as after being, a good bit below average as of May 1st. So a big boost there, with the wet season still to come in southeastern Colorado. Similar at Walsh, a big May. They got some good precipitation in that March storm, and then May has been wet, a little bit above average now, with again the June, July, August wet period still forthcoming, so looking pretty good there. And yeah, I mentioned the Eads station earlier. I just wanted to kind of point out mostly just how extreme last year was. So this is the brown line here is the normal over a full water year, so October 1st onward. The pink line was last water year, and so the entire water year last year, 4.5 inches, which was the driest on record by over an inch, I think, from any previous year. And they have almost that much just in May, just this month so far. And for the water year thus far, almost 8.5 inches. And so getting close to doubling the entire water year last year at this point. So now, a good bit above average at this point in the water year, with again, the historically wetter months still on the way. Go up to Burlington, same story, wet May so far, 140% of average for the water year. Akron, 151% of average for the water year. It's been very wet in, both all the way from March through now. And then wrapping up in Boulder, similar story. You can see the big March snowstorm there, and then just a steady string of storms since April. So now above average for the water year, after being a few inches below as of March 1st. Now 1.5 inches or so above average. All right, so let's kind of try to put that together in terms of what it means for the drought conditions. This is a webcam screenshot I took from the Park Service webcam overlooking Blue Mesa. You can see it doesn't look real high at this point, and we'll see that's what the data shows as well. So here's the National Drought Monitor as of last week. And so you can see just this, the southwestern US in very, very bad shape, going back to, last summer, but going back much farther than that as well. So lots of the D4 exceptional drought category throughout the Southwest, and the extreme drought, the D3, the red color here, covering a large fraction of the Southwest. And if we zoom into Colorado, then we really see this drought, the Continental Divide, serving as the drought divide, as we've been saying, where the Eastern Plains have been quite wet this spring, and it's gone a long way to alleviate the lingering drought conditions, from last year east of the divide, but we just haven't seen that in Western Colorado. And so we still see broad swaths of D4 exceptional drought, and so 16% of the state in exceptional drought, 29% in the extreme drought category, but only just over a half of the state in D1 or worse now, when 3 months ago that was 100% of the state was in D1. And so the east of the divide has had great relief with this cool wet spring, but that's not what we've seen west of the divide. So very serious situation continues in most of Western Colorado. If we go back 6 months ago, this is what the map looked like 6 months ago. So the entire state in D1 and almost the entire state in D2 or worse, and clearly things have gotten better in Eastern Colorado and not so much west of the divide. Here's what it looked like just 3 months ago. And again, we had D4 in the southern Denver metro as of mid-February. And now that is completely gone. And then we see that in the change map. This is the change in the drought monitor category over the last 3 months. And the 5-class improvement, which we don't see on these maps very often, is going from D4 to nothing on the map just in the last 3 months with this string of cool wet weather along the Front Range, but not much change west of the divide. Some modest degradations and modest improvements in a few spots, but basically just the persistence of this really serious drought going back to last summer. And there's today's map again, just as kind of a reminder of what that looks like, or this last week's map. This will get updated on Thursday again this week. And just to kind of zoom that back out, it's always good to kind of look back out as where things stand historically. So this goes back to the start of the drought monitor in 2000, and we see the droughts we always talk about: 2002 into 2003, 2012 into 13. 2018, but then the rapid end of that with the extremely wet winter in 2019, but then the quick return after that, and then the really intense drought last summer through, continuing now in many areas in Western Colorado. All right, so we'll dive in a little bit more into a few of the metrics that we always look at. This is EDDI, the evaporative demand drought index. So this is, a measure of how thirsty the atmosphere has been. This is over the last 3 months. We can see in eastern and especially northeastern Colorado and along the Front Range, it's been exceedingly, not hot, not sunny, and it's been humid. And so those areas having very, very wet conditions with respect to evaporative demand. And obviously we saw that in precipitation as well. West of the divide, it's been near normal evaporative demand, but as you get into the southwestern US, things you can see deteriorating where Southern California, Southern Arizona continue to just be historically hot and dry for the winter time, but still just continued very bad conditions in those areas. If we look at, we've started producing the water balance plots again now that we're into the growing season a bit. And so this is for the going back to April 1st at some of our long-term coagmet sites. This is the percentile ranking of the water balance at this point in the water year. And so here, so percentiles 30 to 70 would be roughly in the near normal range. If we get up in the 80s and 90s, it's kind of quite unusually wet. If we get down to the low numbers, unusually dry. Again, most places in eastern Colorado in the normal to wetter than normal range. But we get down to southwestern Colorado and especially in the Four Corners, so that the second percentile there is probably the worst on record in the 30 or so years that we have data there, and drier than normal in the stations in Western Colorado. So yeah, again, just this kind of same story through all of these, that the situation continues to be very, very bad west of the divide, and things have improved considerably east of the divide. This is deep soil moisture, kind of mapped to the drought monitor category rankings again. So looks bad west of the divide almost everywhere. The 0 to 2 percentile here is sort of, again, probably the worst it's been at this time of the year in the 30 or so years of data for this product. But things, near to wetter than normal in the Eastern Plains. And Peter made a slightly different color scale here to kind of emphasize how unusually wet it is in many places in Eastern Colorado. So here we're getting up into the, top few wettest years on record in terms of soil moisture at this point of the spring in parts of along the Front Range and parts of Eastern Colorado, and in the worst few years on record in Western Colorado. And we see that in other soil moisture products. This is the GRACE-based soil moisture product. Same story, very bad west of the divide. Lots of places very, very wet east of the divide. And same story from veg dry, which kind of combines precipitation, soil moisture, and satellite information about how vegetation is doing. And again, we see that same kind of near normal to moist on the plains, and not a good situation in the west. And I know we'll get into the more detail on the reservoir conditions, and of course snowpack and streamflow, which also look very bad in western Colorado, and we'll get the full story on that from the NRCS in a bit. But these graphs that we make for some of the reservoirs kind of see, we see now that at McPhee in southwestern Colorado, that it's basically below where it's ever been in early May in terms of the reservoir level, and Lake Powell has kind of dipped below that as well, as lowest it's been, at least as long as we have good data for this point in May. So not a good situation in terms of water supply there. So we'll just kind of tee that up for the following presentation. All right, so now we'll take a look at the outlooks going forward, where we're headed. First, we'll look back at the outlooks for the spring, or the late winter and spring. And the bottom line is they weren't very good in the spring. So we'll just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. This was the temperature outlook for February, March, April that would have been issued like at the end of January for the February, March, April period, that kind of pointed toward above normal temperatures over almost the entire continental US. And in reality, what happened was, the western 2/3 of the continental US were cooler than normal during that time period. The forecast was pretty good in the east. We had the big cold snap in February, and then eastern Colorado was cool and wet through that whole period. So it was not a very good temperature outlook there. If we look at what that was for precipitation over that same time period, had the kind of the traditional La Nina forecast of dry to the south and wet to the north. And it wasn't so bad in aggregate, but if we look over Colorado, it wasn't particularly good, as the outlook was for drier than normal conditions, and instead we had wetter than normal conditions in northern Colorado. And then, I guess in southwest Colorado, the outlook was okay, where it did point to drier than average conditions, and that's what we saw. So just to kind of keep that in mind of what, there's still a ton of uncertainty in these seasonal forecasts, as we know, but it's good to kind of keep a look at that. All right, so let's look out toward the future here. In the near term, this is 7-day precipitation forecast. We're going to be mostly dry through Saturday, it looks like, aside from maybe some thunderstorms on the more kind of localized thunderstorms on the eastern plains the next couple days. But most of this precipitation we see here in Northeast Colorado will come in the like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday timeframe. So kind of, take it with a grain of salt, because that's still 5 to 7 days out, but it does look like the pattern's going to turn back to cooler and wetter for a couple days around Memorial Day. Hopefully it'll avoid our, barbecues and whatever people are doing there. Mostly dry west of the divide. That's kind of what we expect this time of year. We're going into the dry season in the mountains in May through the end of June or so. So we kind of put that in perspective of normal. Looks a little maybe over 7 days, and again, mostly late weekend into early next week. Chances to be wetter than normal northeast Colorado, drier than normal in the west, but it's not much drier than normal, because normal is pretty small at this time of year in the mountains and southwest Colorado. 8 to 14 day outlook, looking out a bit further, shows a big ridge of high pressure building in next. So this is for the first week of June. Big ridge of high pressure building into the northwest, and so hot and dry conditions for the Pacific Northwest. cool and wet in the south, like the southern plains. We kind of sit in the middle here, so there's not a lot of confidence in the what that first week of June is going to look like here. Maybe warm and dry west and cool and wet east, but this could shift certainly between now and then. And then looking out to the longer term, so La Nina is over now. That was kind of officially declared a week or two ago by NOAA, that the La Nina that we had through the winter is over, and it's high confidence that it'll be ENSO neutral through the summer. But then the question is, what will happen after that? The models kind of are all over the place as far as that goes, and that's pretty common for this. The forecasts of ENSO in the spring are historically not very good, and so and everyone kind of knows that, and so it's, you know, there's probably not a lot of weight to put on these at this point, but it looks like there's a great, the kind of forecast consensus is there's a better chance of going back into La Nina than there is of going to El Nino. And going back into La Nina would not be what we want to see. The so-called double dip La Nina, having a second winter in a row of La Nina, tends to be bad news for us here in the West in terms of drought, but it's pretty early to say on that. And like I said, the ENSO forecasts at this time of year are generally not very good. So it'll be something we keep an eye on, but nothing to get, you know, exceptionally concerned about at this point. And so here's what the summer outlook looks like from NOAA. And keep in mind, again, these are, the way to interpret these is basically as forecasts of confidence, not of magnitude. So where you see the higher values here, it just kind of points to the forecasters being, you know, much more certain that in this case, southwestern Colorado down through the southwest will be warmer than average this summer yet again. And we can see the outlook being, you know, tilted towards warmer than average across the whole West again. And one other thing to point out is these May outlooks now are with respect to the new 30-year normals. So this is with respect to the 1991 to 2020 period, whereas all the previous outlooks have been with respect to the earlier period. So it is concerning to see this confidence in being above normal for temperature, and that's with respect to a warmer normal than we've had in the past. Precipitation, as always, summer precipitation outlooks are very uncertain, and so I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight on that, but they do tilt towards drier than average. But it's not a very strong tilt. For example, at this point in Silverthorne here, you know, still pretty good odds of any of the outcomes occurring of above, near, or below normal there. And of course, the kind of, you know, the impact of all of this in terms of concerns for the summer. This is the USDA Predictive Services outlook for June. The red areas here are where the potential for large fires is above normal, and you can see the Southwest having been so dry, and California, Oregon, and Western Colorado down. I would guess when they update this, it probably won't include these counties in Southeast Colorado that have had great rain in the last week or two. But the situation remains very concerning in Western Colorado, and it looks pretty similar for July as well. So that, you know, that June through early July period is when historically, before last year, when historically if we get big fires, that's when they've tended to occur. And you know, last year kind of rewrote the book on that, but I think that June to early July period is when we need to be very concerned in western and southwestern Colorado, in the areas that just have not had good moisture and are dry going back to last year or beyond. So takeaways, the Continental Divide is continuing to serve as a drought divide, with the cool and stormy east that has improved things in a huge way, but that has not been the case in most of Western Colorado. all the indicators, snowpack and stream flow, as we'll see next, and soil moisture and everything else on the western slope look very bad as we head into what is historically the driest time of year in western Colorado, of kind of mid-May through the end of June or so. La Nina is over. Summer outlook is tilted towards warmer than average, and I think that early summer is likely to be rough in western Colorado, and our best hope is for an actual monsoon this year that we've missed out on the last few years. So we'll have to wait and see how that comes about. So there's contact info, and happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thanks for that, Russ. Does anyone have any questions? We had.
Hi, this is Emily at Northern Water. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on potential causes for that drought divide, why we might be getting more precip on the east versus west?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to some extent, as we get into March, April, May, especially, it's kind of when we usually see that shift of, so the storms that bring like the big snows to the mountains, especially the western mountains, is when the jet stream is overhead and there's a lot of moisture coming in from the Pacific that slams into those western mountain ranges, and that's when you get the big snow at the ski resorts and on the high terrain up in the park range and all these places. And so we kind of missed out on those in that December, January, February timeframe that we would normally have, or there weren't as many big storms as we would hope to get in a winter. And then usually as we get into the spring, the pattern shifts such that we're drawing in moisture from like the Gulf of Mexico, and it comes in and from the south and then gets wrapped around these upslope storms. So we're bringing the moisture in from the east toward the Front Range, and so that again, March, April, May, we expect to see that. We just had a lot of them. I mean, that the huge storm in mid-March, but then a bunch of additional rain and snowstorms in April. So more of those upslope storms than we usually see, but not as many of those kind of Pacific moisture, slamming into the western mountain storms that we would expect in a winter. So I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. And then we had a question about presentations being available, and yes, they're online at the CWCB website, which I just posted, and our presenters send those to us after, so we'll get those up. We will move on to the NRCS presentation. Looks like we have Carl online.
Yeah, looks like I'm not able to share my screen.
I just made you a co-host, so try that again.
Okay, let me try again. All right.
Thank you, Russ. Great.
Okay, does that look good and you can hear me?
Yes, on both.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Russ. And I'll kind of dive into our standard presentation, but just a couple big picture points kind of following up on Russ's drought information. Really one of the biggest take home points this year as we go into the main stream flow runoff season is that we're really anticipating last summer's and fall's really dry conditions to roll over. So across the state, we're seeing stream flow forecasts be in the range of 30% of normal less than what we saw in peak snowpack. So it is a really unique situation. So that's a point that we're really trying to hammer home is for folks who have just been watching the snowpack throughout the season, we really are expecting a dramatically lower stream flow than would be commonly expected with those conditions. And the other thing I'll mention with respect to looking at snowpack, it is a tricky time of year to really analyze things as we get closer and closer to meltout at the snowtail sites, where the percent of normal gets really jumpy towards meltout. So it's really important to look at not only our current percent of normal snowpack, but also what that peak was, and in combination with water year-to-date precipitation. And really the precipitation can provide quite a bit of information at this point because it does combine both rain and the total accumulated snow, regardless of where the meltout is. But with kind of those big picture things out of the way, I will just dive in. So starting up in Northwest Colorado, current snowpack is at 55% of normal, melting out a couple weeks earlier than usual, but the peak was right around April 1st at 86% of normal. Here looking at what snow is sitting on the ground, generally, and we'll see this across the state with higher elevation sites still holding a fair amount, some of these up as high as over 90%, but a lot of the lower elevation sites completely melted out. And a lot of these white dots are ones that don't have a normal because they commonly would be melted out. So we don't even necessarily have a metric for them. Yeah, basically really across the state, a lot of high elevation sites still holding a decent bit of snow while mid and lower elevations have melted out pretty quickly. So in this region, it's been one of the drier past 2 months. They really didn't get the May precipitation much of the rest of the state saw, but April was just 46% average and May to date is at 68% of average precipitation. Here looking at our full water year graph, you can see it was a pretty good February, but other than that, kind of slow and steady at below normal levels. And you can see these red lines here are the minimum on record, and that's kind of a combination of day by day throughout the year, but really certainly of note that it's not too high above the minimum we've observed at our mountain stations. So this is a map of the actual streamflow forecasts resulting from that snow and precipitation data, as well as this year we really have incorporated a lot of soil moisture information, but really looking at some pretty meager stream flows. One of the best ones, North Platte at Northgate, but unfortunately that doesn't affect a lot of Colorado water users. That's pretty much heading straight into Wyoming. But some of the other major pour points here, the White at Meeker, just 49% of average stream flow. Yampa and Maybell, just 39% of average stream flow. And for those who aren't aware, when I'm talking about these stream flow forecasts, we're looking at the total volume from April 1st through July 31st. So just that primary snowmelt runoff season is what we're looking at here. Reservoir storage, there's really not a ton of storage in these basins, but it does have one of the best, actually I do think it has the best storage in the state with respect to normal, and I believe it's about 106% of average. Moving a little to the south into the Colorado Basin. Snowpack, pretty similar, ended up peaking at 87% of normal, but has had more accumulation throughout the melt season. You can see kind of some of these small increases here. So currently it is at 78% of normal. So that's good that it has had a little bit more accumulation past April 1st. Looking at the snow on the ground, currently really pretty variable from completely melted out to looks like a high of 153% of normal, 136%. And again, that seems to be pretty driven by elevation at this point. So February precipitation, or sorry, that is I promise the numbers are correct, but the months are not. My apologies on that. But so that is April precipitation was 48% of average, and May to date has been 102%. And I will get that switched before I submit it to post online. So my apologies. Water year to date precipitation, currently 79% of average. And quite a bit further above the minimum observed than we saw in the Yampa and White. So that is also a good sign to a certain degree. Stream flow forecasts, kind of in the range of about 50% of average up to 72% of average. But really some of the major points we see down lower in the basin, the Colorado near Cameo down closer to Grand Junction is on the lower end at just 51% of average, where some of the headwaters stations are a little better. A lot of the lower contributing basins are not putting out quite as much. Roaring Fork here at 54%, Dillon inflow 56%. Reservoir storage in the Colorado is doing pretty good in the big picture, and as you'll see, especially compared to our southern basins, but just below average storage and about 60% of total capacity. Here looking at our long-term trends, over the last couple of years, it's been kind of bouncing back and forth around normal values, not huge dramatic swings like we'd see in 2002, 2012. But just throughout this water year, had a slight up and has been on a steady decline, but again, still pretty near average. Moving over to the east, to the South Platte. South Platte had the best snowpack in the state in general and continues to do so. It's currently the only basin that is still holding above average snowpack, and you can see kind of this up and down flat line more or less over the last month or so that has really helped maintain a lot of that high elevation snow, which is really encouraging for water supply across the Front Range. Here's a look at the both the basin-wide data, 121% of normal here, as well as all of our station data along kind of the crest of the continental divide there. So dramatically different than we're going to be seeing in the south. So that is very good for water supply this time of year. Again, my apologies that the dates or the months didn't get switched, but so April had 83% of average precipitation, which I believe was the best in the state. Not a great number overall, but better than everywhere else. And May has been quite good as well at 144% of average precipitation. Looking at our water year total accumulation, very, very near normal, 97% of average total accumulated precipitation, both as snow and rain, which puts us in a very good position going into summer. As would be expected, moving into our streamflow forecasts, this area has some of the highest in the state so far. Obviously driven by that snowpack and precipitation, with some of the lower ones being the mid 70% of average, 75% of average, and some up into the lower 90s. So a pretty tight cluster of values across our major Front Range basins. Reservoir storage across the entire South Platte, quite a bit of variability, a lot of different reservoirs of different sizes, but we can see currently just sitting at barely over average values. I think it might be 102% of average and a little over 80% of total capacity. So looking pretty good there as well. Here's again our long-term graph, and see the big spike from 2019, then a decline, but definitely an encouraging rise through this current water year back up to those near normal values. Now moving down into southern Colorado, some of our more dry areas for not only this year, but unfortunately last year as well. But in the Gunnison Basin, had a decent snowpack peak at 86% of normal, currently 49% of normal. But again, as we get down into these lower values, those percents kind of lose more and more meaning. Averaged across all of our snow cell stations, that's only about 3 inches of snow water equivalent. So it is important to kind of consider the whole season, both with respect to snow and precipitation. Station by station, really, most of them are getting pretty low. Some of these higher ones are our really high elevation stations. Red Mountain Pass up here in the San Juans. This is Schofield Pass. North of Crested Butte, which are some of our higher elevation stations in the entire SNOTEL network. So they're still holding on, but once you go down the hill, things have melted out pretty swiftly. In the Gunnison, April was pretty dang dry, just a meager 34% of average accumulated precipitation. And May to date has been 109% of average. So pretty big uptick and very encouraging. And we'll see that get better and better for May to date as we move further south. Water year to date precipitation has totaled up to be just 72% of average. You know, some months better than others, so not exceptional, but we've certainly seen worse, as you can see from these red minimum lines. Stream flow forecasts, not super inspiring. Many near kind of 50% of average, and down even below that. Some of the big ones: Blue Mesa inflow, 49% of average. Ridgeway, very similar, 48%. With pretty dry conditions in the North Fork of the Gunnison in particular, the contribution all the way down to the outlet at Grand Junction leaves it at just 39% of average volumetric stream flow for the next several months. Reservoir storage, it's doing okay, I would say. Looks like about maybe 82, 83% of average. So not great, but certainly better than its neighbors to the south still. Here, looking at our long-term graph, and again, these are going back to 1992. Really see the big decline over last summer with those really dry conditions and people needing to use that water. And fortunately, there has been a decent uptick, which we really didn't see last year. So definitely started the water year quite a bit lower and has risen, which is good. Down into our southwest basins, the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juans. Again, similar to other places, snowpack did reach a reasonable value, 85% of normal. But you can see here really melting out much earlier than usual, melting out maybe about 3 weeks, 2 weeks or 3 weeks earlier than usual. And most of our stations are getting closer and closer to zero. Looking at our site-by-site data, as we've mentioned, high elevation stations, this is the same one we saw in the Gunnison right on top of Red Mountain Pass, still has 71% of normal. I believe this is probably Slumgullion Pass, which is another really high elevation station, probably around 11,500. But most of our other mid to low elevation stations have pretty much melted out in the San Juans. April precipitation was pretty grim, just 29% average, so really dry in April. But things have definitely picked up, which is encouraging. May to date, 121%. We can really see that considerable dryness throughout April here, and May has picked up a little bit, but definitely pretty dry through the last month and a half. But encouraging that at least May has been decent to a certain degree. Getting into our stream flow forecasts, slightly worse than what we saw in the Gunnison Basin. Again, just mention some of the bigger points. San Juan, as it's leaving the state, at 54% of average. Animas at Durango, just 40% of average. Russ mentioned the low reservoir storage in McPhee, and unfortunately, they're looking at really meager inflow at just 28% of average this season. And we can really see the effect of the last couple dry years with respect to reservoir storage. With last year, there's really no increase, just kind of a brief flat line, and reservoir storage kind of plummeted off, and then again. So unfortunately, that storage has been steadily declining for the last couple years. A little further to the east in the Rio Grande, fortunately, snowpack fared quite a bit better, just that little bit over there, and I'm not sure exactly how the storm tracks drove that, but they ended up with 108% of normal snowpack peak, which is great. And similar to most basins, aside from the South Platte maybe, pretty near April 1st, but has really been melting off very, very quickly since then. And again, most of our stations are just about out of snow. Here's looking at our station by station data. Again, all the ones that are just white dots are ones that would already have been melted out at this time. So we don't have the data for, but here in kind of the western portion of the basin, we've got a couple sites, a couple of our higher elevation sites that still have snow, but largely melted out, leaving it just 43% of average as of now. So our April precipitation was pretty grim, just 32% of average there, but huge turnaround. May has been very productive down in the Rio Grande, which should be very good for them at 172% of average precipitation to date. We can see that here in the chart. All that has left us at 83% of average water year to date precipitation. You can see that dry April with kind of a little uptick in the second half. But some really recent storms have been helping them out a lot. Streamflow forecasts across the Rio Grande, definitely quite a bit better than what we saw in the Southwest San Juans and much of the Gunnison Basin. Some of the more important stations here, the Rio Grande at Del Norte is 58% of average, which I know is not an astounding number, but certainly better than a lot of other stations in Southwest Colorado. And that's, yeah, this kind of the Saguache Creek at Saguache has 68%, which is one of the better ones. And then down here in the Southern Sangres, get up into the mid 70% of average range, which is also really good for those areas. Reservoir storage, as we saw, and neighboring basins, we'll just see it here in a second, definitely been dropping off largely over the last couple of years, but currently is sitting at probably about 75% of average storage and about 25 to 30% of total capacity. And we did see a bit more of an uptick than neighbors to the west there, but certainly a pretty big drop off over the last couple of years and brought back up a little bit. So could be better and could be worse for that situation going into summer, but really great to see that very productive May from a precipitation standpoint. So moving into our final major basin over in the Arkansas. Peak snowpack was at 102% of average, but also you'll notice several weeks earlier, right around April 1st, it kind of flatlined, but quite a bit earlier than normal. Fortunately, they did get some recent accumulations, and I'm guessing that's in more of the headwaters region of the basin. I'd have to double check that. But currently at 72% of normal. So recent precipitation has helped provide kind of little bumps throughout the snowmelt season to maintain that snowpack. And here we can see how it's distributed spatially. Again, not a ton of values on the map this time of year as we get closer and closer to June, but pretty good up in the headwaters here. I believe that's probably Fremont Pass. And then this is on Pikes Peak, our Glen Cove site, seems to be still doing pretty good. And then a couple throughout this is St. Elmo near Salida, and then excuse me, down in the middle Sangres near sand dunes appears to still have some snow. April was pretty dry, just 41% of average precipitation, but May to date has been very, very good. Very similar numbers to the Rio Grande at 175% of average precipitation so far. And here we can see that again in the time series chart. Some accumulations in late April, but it's really been a pretty strong May so far, with the most recent time period bringing in quite a bit of moisture, leaving the basin at 89% of average water year precipitation. Streamflow forecasts are definitely pretty good compared to other regions, really aside from the South Platte. Some of the major points here, Arkansas at Salida, 73% average, and then even maintaining down to Pueblo Reservoir inflow at 71% of average. And really the southern portion of the Sangres within the state did reasonably well, kind of Huacharas, Huerfano, at near 80% of average streamflow forecasts, a little drier down towards Trinidad. Reservoir storage kind of in the middle of the pack, middle to lower part of the pack as far as the state is concerned, right near 70% of average storage and 20% of average capacity, but that's, or 20% of total available capacity, excuse me. And that's pretty normal for the Arkansas, really. A lot of that being driven by John Martin having so much available storage. Kind of a more interesting long-term trend over the last 4 years or so, with pretty steady declines in the reservoir storage, with the exception of 2019 there, with that big 2019 year saw a good increase and then more or less steadily decreasing from there over the last couple of years. So now we'll look at some of our statewide numbers, and a lot of these products will have our individual basin information here, but as Russ mentioned, it's really important to just focus on the basin of interest because it has been extremely variable across the state. So our kind of statewide average values don't hold the most value for individual areas. But either way, the statewide number is currently 69% of normal snowpack. Highest again being up here in the South Platte with kind of a later initial melt and just kind of continuing storms throughout, maintaining that snowpack. And then the lowest down here in the Southwest San Juans at just 31% of normal snowpack. Looking at our full-time series graph, this is averaged across all SNOTEL sites in the state. Peak reached 91% of the normal value. Currently at 71% of normal. You can see kind of had a slight break in ablation here, which allowed it to looking like we're getting closer and closer to a normal melt out time. But again, that really varies quite widely basin to basin. April precipitation across the whole state, again, this is specifically to the mountainous areas, was 48% of average, and May has been 122% of average, with most major basins receiving above average precipitation this month so far. So this is looking at our month-to-date precipitation, SNOTEL by SNOTEL, and we have this available on our interactive map. We did unfortunately have an issue with the zoomed in sub-basins that we usually have, so I had to remove those. But I do have the statewide where you can see really pretty strong precipitation values across the whole state, with the exception of the Yampa and White basins being kind of the driest pocket, and a few random stations really in the central mountains. But the biggest thing of note here is this Yampa White was the standout, receiving the lowest May precipitation so far. Currently, water year to date, precip again, 79% of the average value, and averaging across the whole state, it kind of smooths out this line a little bit, with the biggest thing of note is that really dry first half of April, which we've touched on a few times. So here we can see this in map form. As one would anticipate, really just follows the snowpack trends, kind of highest in our northern Front Range mountains and lowest down in the San Juans. This is a little more generalized map of streamflow forecasts, but again, showing kind of the lowest forecast being in the Yampa White, the lower Gunnison, and the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juans, with some of the highest. It doesn't really show up on the color map, but some of the highest being most certainly in the South Platte, and then the Arkansas doing pretty good, and some portions of the southern Rio Grande as well. So here's looking at our reservoir storage. Statewide, we're holding 85% of average storage and 49% of total capacity. Kind of unfortunately, this is also due to the multi-year drought situation where the basins that kind of didn't do the best for snowpack and precipitation this year are also holding the lowest reservoir storage. So water resource management could certainly be pretty challenging in a lot of our southern basins this year, and maybe a little more flexible in the north. So here's our bar chart of kind of the month by month reservoir storage, how things have changed throughout the year. Averaged across the state, it's really maintained at pretty steady levels overall. Similar in the San Juans, Upper Rio Grande, not too much. We saw that decrease in the Arkansas. Yeah, the steady increase in the South Platte, increase in the Gunnison is good to see with their fairly meager looking streamflow forecasts this year. Looking at our long-term graph, again, going back to 1992, we can see this big increase through 2019 after that really big snow year. And statewide, we really can see that steady decrease. While some basins saw an increase from last year's snowmelt runoff, statewide, it really kind of just flattened out for a little bit and then continued a steady decline throughout this water year. We have seen some slight increases, which at this point, every little bit helps. So that is good to see even a little bit. So just big picture take home points here. That below average April precipitation did lead to very noticeable decreases in our streamflow forecasts. Across the state, it was pretty common to see a 10 to 15% decrease from our April 1st streamflow forecast through our May 1st. So we really are anticipating that dry month to have an impact across most of the state. So that's something to keep an eye on, and really just keep up to date with the most current forecasts as conditions change. The good news on the flip side is May to date precipitation has been above average across most of our basins, with the southern basins receiving quite a bit, which they really need. The Arkansas and Rio Grande, the biggest, but it's really great to see those southwest basins, the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan get above average precipitation so far. The statewide snowpack peak this year was 91% of normal near April 1st. But again, can't drive home enough that it was really variable across all of the mountains of Colorado. And again, with the exception of the South Platte, all other major basins have been observing an earlier than normal snow melt as well. So that'll obviously affect the timing of the resulting stream flow, and something to watch closely as we go forward. Just to mention this, statewide reservoir storage is 85% of average, but with generally the southern basins holding lower amounts relative to normal than the northern basins. And as I mentioned at the start, our really biggest take home point from this year is that we are anticipating last summer and fall's pretty severe drought to have more of an impact on this summer's streamflow runoff than we've ever really seen. It's pretty notable, to say the least, that our streamflow forecasts are for 30% more or less than what we saw as a peak snowmelt or snowpack accumulation. So for those who've really just been watching the snowpack in particular, that's a really big consideration, and keep an eye on the actual forecasts as well. And that is all I had, and I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Hey, Carl, it's Russ. Just a comment. Actually, I put it in the chat too. We had heard from some folks down in Southeast Colorado. There's a huge jump on the purgatory after the rain they had in Trinidad over the weekend, and you can really see it in the stream flow there. It might be more temporary, given that it was a local rainstorm, but it's kind of interesting. It's like close to record high right now, at least for the moment.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I had not heard that. Thank you. That is good to know and definitely interesting.
Thanks. Any other questions for Carl? Now we can move on to our report from our water providers and task forces. There's a good number of folks on the phone today. I'm gonna try something different and see if we can do maybe this by region of the state. I want to make sure that the new folks from the Southwest region who have joined today have enough time to just either ask questions or provide updates. So I would like to start with any water providers in the Southwest for an update on conditions down there or any questions that you have for this group. So this can also be discussion time or just provide your standard update. Ken, do you want to try and kick us off?
Sure. No, your reports capture the numbers pretty accurately. I think it's the 2 years in a row that really knocked us out. Last year was very similar with slightly better conditions in the snowpack, but the yield was only about 34% of what would have been expected from 100% snowpack. The end result was we did use all our storage, or 90-some% of it last year. We have a large inactive pool that we're sitting on, but does not go out to the water supply. So with those anemic numbers that were shown on the inflows, we're looking at about a 5 to 10% project supply. Our neighbors to the east, Mancus, has a 0% supply. I think like us, are holding their M&I reserves and have no other supplies. We have our M&Is covered, but otherwise 5 to 10% going out. So you capture the conditions. It's been the repetitive nature of the dry years and the dry soils and the change to the runoff as expected. Recent rains were good and helped, but a long way from alleviating the drought situation. Thanks, Megan.
Okay, any other emergency managers down there that would like to add anything?
Yeah, hi Megan. It's Tom McNamara with the Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management down here in Southwest, and I think all of us down here are really watching the conditions for a number of reasons, not just the fire, but also the water supply just across the board. And like Ken just mentioned, some of the numbers that we saw are actually some of the higher numbers that we've seen in the small creeks, and the smaller reservoirs are getting hit just as hard or worse than the bigger ones. So this is really great that you've got this going on. Glad we were able to join, and I think we'll be a regular participant going from here out if we haven't been before. But I think all the local agencies, governments are looking at what to do coming up, and not just for the agriculture and the water storage that's makes available for agriculture, but that supplies so many of the local and domestic well systems that are very quickly affected by how much water comes down. And I think we're going to be seeing some impacts this year. Don't know what, don't know where, but I'm sure we will be. So thank you.
Okay. And for you and others, if you would like to be added to the Water Availability Task Force updates, that's getting the agenda announcements and things like that. or others in your agency, just shoot me an email with those names, and I can make sure that you get those in advance. Desi from DOLA has an update related to the Southwest, so I'm going to prompt her here.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Desi Santera with Department of Local Affairs. I just wanted to add that our Southwest DOLA regional manager is also engaged and in conversation with many of the communities in that region. He doesn't have any specific updates either, but is aware that many of the communities are talking about water restrictions for their users. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that and report back as we hear more about those water restriction decisions and any municipal water providers that are experiencing shortages. Thank you.
Thanks. Karen from Telluride said she's going to pass anyone else from Southwest basins. Browsing the list here. Do we have anyone from Colorado River Basin? Okay. What about the Yampa? I don't see anyone from North Platte, but anyone from Yampa? I feel like this is a bad game show thing. Bad bingo card. All right, what about anyone from the Arkansas here? I see, let's see. I don't see anyone from the Rio either. So I think we could move into the Front Range folks. If I skipped you, you can jump in. But who from the Front Range would like to kick it off?
Hey Megan, this is Brian Fitzpatrick from City of Aurora.
Go ahead.
Our current water demand is about 15% less than last year. Obviously with the rain, it's been very beneficial here. Currently our storage is at 67% of capacity. Our average is 69% of capacity, so we're right there. And the city is not contemplating any watering restrictions as of yet.
This is Swithin with Centennial Water, and likewise for most of the South Platte, the wet cool spring has been very beneficial, as Russ showed 5 category improvement in drought rating for here in Douglas County. Our current storage is 44% of capacity. That's 10% lower than we normally are at this time. We did institute a drought watch at the end of April. We're maintaining that position, and expecting lower runoff and stream flows. But we have been able to put some more water in storage, so things are looking much better than they were a month ago.
Hi, everyone. Jason Fineout from Denver Water. Speaking first on our storage, kind of similar to Brian over there. Our current is at 83% full. Average is normally 86% full this time of year, so we're close. And then, as you guys might know, 50% of our water supply comes from the South Platte River, and then 50% comes from the Colorado River. And while the wetter and cooler weather here in the Front Range has certainly helped out with delaying irrigation season, our demand is certainly down, and the South Platte is looking better. Our Colorado River supplies are very much a concern. So just like a lot of the other Front Range providers who have systems that extend out to the western slope, it's been a real difficulty to communicate to customers who see all of this wet weather that we are still very much in drought in our system and that they have to conserve. And so that's been a challenge, and it will be one moving forward as well.
This is Katie Mazurowski with Colorado Springs Utilities. And right now our reservoirs are at about 70.3% of capacity, and our average from 2001 to 2020 is about 67.4%. So we're still holding steady at about 4% above average. And it's actually nice to see Pikes Peak still has some snow on it, which you don't usually see for this time of year. Demands for May have been significantly below average compared to last year. I think we're at about 25 to 35% lower than May in 2020. So as you can imagine, that's due to all the nice, cool, wet weather that we've had the past few weeks. Rampart is currently full, so that's also nice to see coming into a pretty dry summer. And we're also not anticipating going into watering restrictions at this time. And I think that's about all I have.
This is Isabella Rite with the City of Boulder. We're very fortunate to be placed right where a lot of the snow came down. So our Middle Boulder Creek Reservoir is should be filling in the next week or two, we expect, and then North Boulder Creek High Mountain Reservoirs are runoff is just kind of ramping up now, and we're hoping to get those filled. April demands were a bit lower than usual, and May demands, I don't have the final numbers yet, but I expect that those are lower than they have been in past years because of the precipitation we've gotten. And at this time, we do not expect to implement any sort of drought restrictions either.
Hey, sorry, Jason Fineout again from Denver Water. I forgot to mention that we are also not planning on implementing any drought restrictions right now, but we're reevaluating throughout the summer as we start to see melt and kind of what that looks like.
Any other providers have updates for the group? Okay, then I would like to open it up generally to other departments. I don't know if CPW or DNR or others have updates for the task force.
Megan, this is Joel Sneakloth.
Hey.
Hey. Yeah, this is definitely a tale of two parts of the state, Nat, wet and dry. But everybody chats up how great wet weather is. It is for municipalities. Agriculture is now having their fair share of problems. Stuff planted. Corn planting is a solid 15% behind average. We should be about approaching 80 to 90%, 80 to 85% planted by now. According to the crop progress, we're only about 2/3 planted. And thanks Russ for giving me that nice 10-day forecast of showing more rain for our area. Right now we've had what 10.5 inches of about 10.5 inches for the calendar year here in Akron. I know there's areas that are wetter, even more wetter than us. So we're in saturated conditions right now trying to get anything done field wise. So we're out of the field for a lot of areas for the next few days unless you're very sandy soils. Yeah, we need some warmth.
Yeah, could you give just the basic just for the group kind of how the rain has held back planting and kind of what the primary challenges are you're experiencing?
Well, the primary challenge is maintaining a tractor without sinking to China. And then also even on wet conditions, getting the seed rows to close back up. So those are the problems. And if we can plan around potholes, but when the entire field, you drive the tractor in, you're leaving 5-6 inch ruts that's a problem you pay for the rest of the year and even into next year. So, and we're getting late on a lot of corn. Generally, in this corner, we're planted quite well, but we're not. People are starting to change varieties. That's getting to be hard because the drier areas are planted that plant the short season corn varieties, and trying to find those is becoming difficult, or shorter seasons. The other issue is the ranchers, at least, are very happy with all the rain, but they need some heat. Normally, they're turning cattle out, and cattle can maintain themselves on pasture at this point. They said the grass is not growing as fast. We're not getting the sunlight, and the heat units need to start kicking a lot of these grasses to grow. So it's a catch-22. Yeah, we like the rain. Yeah, we're getting a lot. Can't make anybody happy, but there are issues with that as well. Robert would never say anything bad about rain, though.
Robert, do you have anything to add either from the board or from your area?
I would have a question for any of the water providers. I know I had heard on the news that like City of Greeley and I think even City of Fort Collins were really thinking about instituting restrictions, mainly because they're concerned about runoff from the burn areas. So.
Hey, Megan, this is Andrew with the City of Greeley. I can speak to that to some degree. At this point, there's no talk of restrictions, but there's definitely, fire mitigation response actions in place right now, such as aerial mulching and just monitoring the stream flows. I can't speak on behalf of Fort Collins though, but other than that, Greeley's numbers look good for storage capacity this year, and I don't believe the board is even thinking about drought restrictions at this point.
Thanks, Andrew.
Any other updates from our industries or agencies? Okay. The next meeting is going to be, oh, go ahead. Who's that?
Megan.
Oh, you can.
Yeah, I mean, one thing with these droughts, I heard they were restricting fishing, I believe, up on the Yampa. I noticed David's here, but we're working closely with our CPW reps, but there's not much we can do with the lack of water. We're going to have a big impact downstream of McPhee on the fishery. But it's something else that could roll into the summer and the tourist season. I mean, along with the fisheries, their own health is going to suffer, but that also rolls like fires and some of the other tourist type impacts. So I wondered if CPW had any foreshadowing, or are we just waiting to get results? I mean, we'll probably know more once the season's over down here.
Thanks, Ken. Rob Harris here. I need to check in with our biologists down in the Southwest to see how they plan to deal with the summer season that's coming up. So I'll be sure to have that update for you for our next meeting here.
Yeah, and this is David Graff with CPW out of the Northwest. One of the reasons that I'm participating in this for the first time is in the Northwest, as indicated by all the data that we just saw. It's not looking like a very good water year. Streamflow forecasts are so far down that we already are, anticipating concerns. We've released water out of reservoirs the last couple years to mitigate for some of the impacts to fisheries on the White River as well as on elk. The water supply forecast I'm not even sure if Steamboat Lake got filled this year, so I'm not sure we're going to have that flexibility there this year. We're trying to, right now, position ourselves to mitigate stream flow conditions in the White with a little bit of release from Lake Avery through an expedited loan. But you're exactly right, Ken. You know, the fishery situation is going to be a little bit dire. And we're, you know, our Northwest Regional leadership is convening sort of our own version of a internal task force to sort of figure out what we can do. And it's not just for this year, but also looking forward, just because these conditions aren't going to change anytime soon, it doesn't look like. So thanks for the presentation. It's been really interesting. And I wish there were better news over here on the West Slope.
Okay. I entered in the chat the schedule for the summer, and then I had a few questions about this. So just a reminder that if you want to access the recording of this presentation and discussion, or either of the presentations from NRCS or the Colorado Climate Center, you can go to our CWCB website, and I'm going to post that again for folks who joined late here. And there's always a single page, we call it a drought summary, but it's essentially a summary of this meeting's primary conditions and outlook for the next month. And that's always posted about within a week or two of this meeting, depending on our schedules. So all questions that you have just about engaging in the this meeting, types of conversations you would like to have, we could really get anything on these agendas. We have a pretty standard just agenda for each month, but knowing that we are in such variable conditions across the state, if there are explicit conversations that anyone here would like to have, just reach out to me, and Tracy and I can find a way to get those on the agenda, or have that, or organize a conversation appropriate outside of this task force. Tracy, do you have anything else before we disperse?
I don't think so, Meg.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for everyone who joined, and for folks who joined for the first time. And this is definitely a resource to engage with each other, as well as state partners. So always feel free to do that openly. So have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Hermione?